I was looking through the exhibition catalog. There's a terrific essay in there about the history of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in and of itself. And I think when we think about the Met being founded as a museum for a nation, they trace the history in that essay back to a party, in fact, in 1866 that was celebrating 90 years since the Declaration of Independence in the US. And I've been reflecting on that a lot, like what is the purpose and role of spaces like the Met and QAGOMA? I mean, this is something natural to think about when thinking about place. The last section of the exhibition is called Art for the People. I really believe in that. I think I spoke last time about art as a lifeblood, lifeline for society. It is, and having a space where we can always enjoy it and know we can enjoy it is absolutely crucial. And I think the Met is still free to enter. I think there's a pay as you wish policy. I remember taking that very seriously as a student. We used to go to New York for these tours as groups. We'd sometimes go with our profs. We'd sometimes go by ourselves because we wanted to experience the New York scene. So this was from Kingston in Canada, long bus ride down to New York. And I remember going to the Met, and my friend and I, well, it's either dinner or pay a lot to the gallery. And we ended up, having a medium price dinner and giving some money to the museum because we thought it was inappropriate to go in for a quarter or whatever. But anyway, I think the fact that the Met is still open in that way, the National Gallery in London, I think as well. So that, possibility to go and revisit over and over again is amazing. So let's take advantage of our QAGOMA and our permanent collections and visit those as often as we can and come in and enjoy art for the people. It matters. Also for a session on the power of place. I think we have to be open to multiple geographies and temporalities and allow ourselves to travel not only to other places but times as well, and that's what makes this show so important. And all of that, I think, is part of why I chose in the first session to mention to you that my own background is a Czech, Canadian, now Australian. When I think of place and my kind of patchwork identity, that fosters my approach to thinking and writing about art. And I think art is at its most vital when it enables cross-cultural dialogues and fosters that kind of empathy and understanding. And I've talked about how the paintings in the Met show are immigrants too. I love thinking about them as immigrants. So to New York, and now they're here visiting us. So, and locating those works in their original context is an exciting task that we need to constantly be aware of. So, a diverse show, geography and place, very important. I've been saying that all along. And we, in fact, have a very kind of multicultural show to hand. We have to be a bit careful before saying there is such a thing as European painting. I know there's a reason for calling the show that. I fully understand that. But looking and digging deeper and thinking in these classes about the nuances and the diversity of places represented there, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands. What is Europe? When we had Brexit earlier, that question came to sharp relief. Is there such a thing as a united Europe? So that's a question, I think, that will linger once the show leaves as well. That question is not going away. I'd also like to point out that a point of origin can differ from a home. So some never leave their point of origin, others would really like to, others do. What is a home? So I think about that a lot as someone who moved here, who's raising children here. This is home, but so is Canada. It's interesting. And then when I go to Czech Republic, that's home too. So it's like this multiplicity, and I think that's something we can think about with our immigrant visitors as well. So that final question moves us into thinking about place a bit less from a geopolitical perspective and more into how do our immediate surroundings impact and shape our characters and our emotional states. We can be in tune with or in discord with our environments. In art, they're expressions of belonging or an uncanny sense of being ill at ease or discomforted. Those are often present in plenty of ways. And I've been thinking about polarizations for place. So urban and rural, leisure and work, spaces for sacred and secular, public and private, dream and reality, familiar and exotic. All of those could be themes for a tour through the Met Show. I really have said this many times. There are 20 ways you could approach thinking about this show. And that's the richness of it. So, and thinking about place and those polarizations I just mentioned, I mean, that's just something that's shining through for me each time I go through, contemplating where to situate the space that I'm looking at. So that's kind of what I want to explore with you today. And I just want to highlight that kind of questioning is really happening in other galleries as well. The IMA and Outer Space. In addition to visiting QAGOMA, visit those smaller galleries too. They're interrogating questions around place and space with great intensity, and we'll talk about that later with Chris. All right, I'm going to show an image now. Okay. And look, for a change, I'm starting at the end of the show instead of the beginning. Every other session, and we're about to hitch right back to early modern, as you know from your slide sheet, but we're going to start here for a very important reason, because I think there's no one who took the question of place and emotive states as seriously as Claude Monet. His paintings are so often replicated. I mean, we can feel a numbness to the Impressionists sometimes, I think, because they are so replicated. They get this, read as sort of pretty pictures. But as ever, there is much to unravel when you take a closer look and consider context. You can find Monet's water lilies in many galleries. There are so many of them. He had an almost compulsive and obsessive approach to this subject. And it's, an instance of the serial in art. So, an artist engaging over and over and over again with the same subject. And you probably know his haystack series, where it's like haystack at morning, haystack midday, haystack, late in the evening. And then the seasons, okay, winter, summer, etc. So, the idea of considering that subject over and over again, but with different environmental factors coming in upon it, that is, what is part of thinking about Monet's work, not just here. And, as for the water lilies, Monet painted them more than 250 times. That's just the ones we know. There's probably more than that. And his first series dedicated to the theme, it was about 25 of them, and that was an exhibition in 1900. And 9 years later, he did another exhibition with about 48 of them, and then it just increased. And as he goes through life, late in life, it pretty much becomes one of the only things he's painting. Monet said it himself. I love it when I can actually quote the artist, because a lot of the older artists that I think about, I don't have a lot of testimonial from them, but with Monet we do. He said, "These landscapes of water and reflection have become an obsession." So he admits it himself. I think this is a great one to look carefully at. This is a painting about surface and texture and paint. Forget locating the work with land or sky or, situating more broadly. Honing right in. We're doing close looking. He's forcing us to do close looking. The sky is only a reflection in what we see here. We're fully immersed in the water lilies in and of themselves. And that was why I ended last week's session with them, because it's a careful, concerted study of the thing in and of itself. And the sense of scale is extraordinary. 2 meters, I think, by 1. It's huge. Gobbled at their look in the show itself. And from a formalist perspective, so thinking about how the thing is put together. Monet's palette and approach to spots of color, this is what paves the way for abstraction. So he's very important to the history of art from that perspective. These are studies in light and color. There's no anchoring feature or perspective in here. A kind of third dimension is suggested by the way some of the water lilies are angled. And it's, as I said, really, the lilies in and of themselves. Portrait of this plant, this kind of plant. Now I think with the overarching emphasis on Impressionists as painting en plein air, so everyone has a sense of this. The Impressionist painters go out, they set up their camp, they paint on site, it's very, immediate. No underdrawings, the history of painting, if you think about what it takes to create a finished painting, prior to what you see, the artist makes a sketch, then makes an underdrawing on the canvas, then builds up from that. So there's this whole process traditionally built into it, right? And then the Impressionists as sort of doing away with some of those elements and working more directly on their canvases. But I think it's important to realize, it gets forgotten sometimes that there's nothing, that this isn't instantaneous, what Monet has presented here. He would work and rework. And what also gets forgotten, and this is where we come to the sense of place, is that Monet carefully planted and composed the water lilies themselves before he painted them. So he had a hired team of gardeners. I mean, he's hard work in Giverny, which is 40 minutes outside of Paris. This is his final home where he spends most of his last years. And in that garden, he is with a team he's hired, arranging his river, like literally diverting it in a particular way so that it looks a certain way. Planting lilies, other flowers, willows, bamboo. Quote from Monet, "My finest masterpiece is my garden." So I think what's required of us with this painting is in fact to think about Monet as an avid gardener. In other words, he organized his garden as much as his paintings. And, I think you can, to this day, I've never been there actually, to Giverny, where, he had his home and garden and worked on all of these projects. He's plotting and planting and painting 3 Ps, really working hard to create a painting out of nature as much as what he puts on the canvas. So a very good way of thinking of this is that nature resembled his art, not the other way around. Many of you have, I'm sure, heard of Marcel Proust, the writer, and there's a quote from him as well. He says, "If I can someday see Claude Monet's garden, I feel sure that I shall see something that is not so much a garden of flowers as of colors and tones, less an old-fashioned flower garden than a color garden, so to speak, one that achieves an effect not entirely nature's, because it was planted so that only the flowers with matching colors will bloom at the same time, harmonized in an infinite stretch of blue or pink." So there is order to this. There is intention even in the selection of the plants and their arrangement before he puts his brush to the canvas. So that, I think, is really an interesting aspect of these. And the water lilies absolutely were his favorites. He diverted a river to construct a pond for them. He was really careful with the pond. He wanted to ensure that it was kept clean of other vegetation so that the water lilies would reflect light perfectly. And, I'm reading this, he has 6 gardeners. One of them was charged with only the water lilies, so he took them very, very seriously. There's a lot of beautiful testimonial around these works. When World War I broke out, he was 74 years old. He's tucked away at Giverny, and he decides to create another multi-panel water lily series. And, when the war ends, the armistice, he presents this series to the French state as a symbol of peace. So it's really quite moving, actually. And I think in the Orangerie in Paris, you can see this installed. I'm seeing nods. Many of you probably know this already, but for those of you who don't know, it's an extraordinary experience because it's sort of like a room, like an oculus, like a pond, right? He's bringing a pond to life, and that's his symbol of peace. I find this, the power of plants, and that's something that is going to run through this lecture because, I want to think about plants and why they matter to place, how they're evocative of place. And that's something our guest artist, Chris Bassi, does a lot in his practice as well. I said I never think about money when I do my art history, but I am sort of fascinated by the price tags that get attached to works like this. One of Monet's, I can't even, like, nothing should be worth this, but $70.4 million for a particular water lily pond. And I think a Monet record is like 110 million for a haystack. So it's quite extraordinary, especially if you think of them as these serial paintings. Okay, so now back to the old days. I have to, because, and this like, I think this is one of the works in the show that people aren't necessarily fully taking in. And I would like to explore it with you because I think it's an incredible work. And for a session on the power of place, and with this emphasis I want to draw on flora, this one matters a lot. So, and in a way, I'm sort of circling back because it helps us, it reminds us that a Monet does not happen overnight. You know, in our sessions, we've been thinking about, you know, in human, non-human, we thought about how important it was to have human presence in these paintings for such a very, very long time. And then you have the emergence of still life and landscape. And in a way, thinking about, especially plants, helps us to chart that history as well. So dialing it back here to the 15th century, and I really have a sense of joy looking at this work. And those emotive responses matter as well. They are not to be dismissed in favor of a dry scholarship. This work gives me joy because, and this is, so Giovanni Di Paolo, he's an artist from Siena. That's his place of origin. And Siena is a place that our friend Vasari, who has come up a few times, doesn't really properly accord the significance it deserves. He's, oh, Siena, you know, sort of, and he doesn't rate the artists from there as highly because they aren't as interested in the emergence of perspective as a device for paintings. You know, a lot of Sienese artists are engaging more with patterning and colors and less to do with that kind of single point perspective as it develops in Florence with people like Brunelleschi. And so the point is, and you can see that here in this work, this is, you know, a surface-driven work as well, full of colors and patternings. And Giovanni Di Paolo, he started out as a manuscript illuminator. He did a lot of illustrations of works by Dante. But he also was commissioned for quite a few altarpieces for local monastic communities and also hospitals, okay? We've talked about the former quite a lot. So those devotional images we looked at in previous weeks where I always said, this is in a monastery, it matters, it's for contemplation, the Fra Angelico, for example. And now I've mentioned hospitals. And I'm gonna come back to this a bit later, but I just want you to think about that because, you know, art in hospitals having curative and meditative functions, the very functional quality to these works. So for devotion and literally as part of curing or therapy, that's extraordinary. And if you think of the role of art in hospitals today, this is kind of a really interesting area of research. In Canada, I know in Montreal, there was this program dedicated to immersing art in hospitals and how it could function in there as a restorative kind of element. So art is medicine. Think about it. I think it's really, and there's so many spaces to engage with that idea in this period because they took that art so very, very seriously. And again, art for the people. It's not about an elitism at all. It's about the works being available and, yes, part of daily practice and in some cases curing. Now this one here, okay, what is he showing us? Well, it's a garden, some kind of Renaissance garden. And let's remember that the garden in the Renaissance, it was not just a place of natural beauty or the growth of foods for sustenance, but also spiritual nourishment, a way of communicating with God. And it was thought of on par with the creations of painters and sculptors. To be a gardener meant a lot in this period. You were considered on par. And that, again, the kind of emphasis on painting as an art form is something that emerges much later, like 18th, 19th century. In this period, the gardener mattered as much as the visual artist, creating altarpieces like this. So the garden could have sacred and secular intent. You can think of tropes like the Virgin Mary shown in an enclosed garden. That's an indication of her purity, her virginity. And, you know, with the secular, the idea of collaboration that a garden could enable. So you could have the sculptor, the gardener, an engineer diverting those rivers. So I like to think of those moments of collaboration as well. I think they're very important to understanding those kinds of spaces. And personally, you know, Monet had that in mind as well. So look at this work. This is just great. These figures set within a garden, they're all paired off, complementing each other. It's involved. They're holding hands. They're in communion with each other as much as their surroundings. You can see a lot of these white habits and black cloaks, and those are the Dominicans, the order of monks that would have sponsored this work. You can see it's kind of like commoners mixing with the elite, okay? You have a papal tiara, you have a bishop, you have the monks, you have these very fashionable youth, and you know why they're fashionable, because we can see their legs with their stockings, and we talked about that in the fashion session. The legs do stick out now that I'm looking at it, this blown up. So a cardinal over here, and they're, you know, fashionable long gowns. They're just interacting, engaging. This is paradise. Paradise is being with friends and surrounded by plants. I like this idea a lot. And then, you know, you have this, you'll probably notice this angelic figure, you know, sort of up top. And something I'll point out to you, and this is sort of the kind of knowledge you glean from exhibition catalogs and people who spend their lifetimes devoted to studying and understanding the materiality of these works, that this is cut down from a larger scene. So originally it was part of what we call a predella, which is the base of an altarpiece. So you have the main scene up top, and then you have a predella down below. And that would be used to show scenes of creation, of paradise, life of Christ, life of the Virgin Mary. So the altarpiece is not rarely just the thing in and of itself in this period. It includes smaller scenes down below. And this is an example of this. Last week I talked about attributes, and art historians have spent a lot of time identifying various figures in here based on the animals they're accompanied by. I don't want to get into that too much right now, but just to say that, you know, with some precision, they've argued this is St. Augustine and his mother, for example. So based on St. Augustine always being shown with this attire and with his elderly mother. So, and, you know, art historians spend a lot of time proposing, you know, giving various propositions. Oh, I think it's this saint. No, I think it's this one. And, you know, thinking about the history of iconography, what they know to be usual ways for these individuals to be presented, that kind of thing. So what I love, though, I mean, it's this garden, this lush meadow, and back to the plants. I mean, we see this row of carefully cultivated apple trees up here, acting like a kind of framing device. But then just look at the variety of plants. Okay, for a long time, art historians would say, okay, interest in showing plants in and of themselves happens in the 16th century. It's rubbish. If we look at a lot of medieval works or earlier works like this, you see this variety in the plants. That's extraordinary. These rabbits kind of frolicking, it's bliss, it's paradise, okay? And I mentioned, I'm going to show you work that is not in our show, but it is in the Met collection. This is one that will never leave the Met, actually, because it's in the Robert Lehman collection. Now, Lehman was a collector who left his works in the Met with the strict proviso that the works never leave. So, and also always be displayed in exactly the way that he left them. This is a curatorial, I'm looking at Sophie, like this is a curatorial challenge. Like if you think of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, same thing. You know, this amazing collector leaves all this stuff and then says, it's got to stay exactly the same. And if you don't leave it exactly the way that I've displayed it, that's it. It's coming out. My heirs will remove it. So anyway, that is totally an aside. But again, labels are your friends. And when you see Robert Lehman collection, it will never leave New York. But back to the images. So these two were part of the same altarpiece. And actually, I should have them the other way around, because this one would have been first in the kind of horizontal sequence in which they appeared. And I love this work in terms of thinking about space as well, because we have like literally this presentation of the cosmology of the period, right? Earth-centered universe. All these concentric bands, the elements, the astrological symbols, different constellations. So this is literally a presentation of the universe as it was understood in the period. So the sense of place, and God the Father swooping in here, you know, pointing out, you know, literally touching almost like the creation happening. And then over here, the expulsion from paradise. And again, this garden-like setting, these carefully matching here, these carefully cultivated trees. And also, you know, thinking back, because now we can do this, we can make links back to what we've studied before. The nudity here is quite shocking, actually, because it's not just Adam and Eve. This angel, this is so rare, okay, to see an angel presented in the flesh like that. Some say it's sort of camaraderie, like, okay, you guys, you're just like, we'll join together. But meaning that, again, we have, if we look carefully, there's always a detail or two that you can find that's quite striking. But I wanted to show you these together because they would have been seen together in the altarpiece as it was originally created and presented. And plants matter to both, to our interpretation of both. They really, really do. So think about that. I mean, how plants can be evocative of paradise in this instance. And I think Monet would have liked something like that. Okay. Now, we talked about this work last week too, and I just wanted to return to it in terms of the power of place and thinking about foliage and a different approach here from that Garden of Paradise, where all of a sudden we have nature under attack, right? The fire in the background threatening this beautiful woodland scene. We have more a jagged approach. This is not about careful cultivation. Remember I talked about how Piero di Cosimo is trying to show us a wild, ancient prehistory, if you will, flush with inhabitants that are sort of unfamiliar to us. These satyrs, the centaur in the background, the strength, with animals attacking other animals, flushed out by the forest fire, and then being hounded and attacked in and of themselves. And so we talked about the non-human kind of elements in here. But if we think about our plant life, that's important to articulating this as another space. Nature under attack, jagged limbs, like there's nothing careful and cultivated about it, as there was in the previous two images I showed you. When art historians show works by Piero di Cosimo, they love to quote Vasari. I already did that. I'm going to do a couple more because they're just incredible quotes. I think I read this one to you last week. This idea of Piero di Cosimo as an eccentric who was terrified of thunderstorms, living more like a beast than a man. At the same time, so we have that vision of Piero di Cosimo, but at the same time, I mean, look at this. He's working hard on his articulation of, so there's a new technique that matters a lot in this period called foreshortening, and that's when you show body compressed in space to give indication of length, okay? So while all this chaos is going on, at the same time, he's like, look at me, I can do this. I can make that body articulated in that way that is becoming very important in artistic circles in the period. And famously, I mean, an artist you could look up in this regard is Paolo Uccello, who shows famously this Battle of San Romano, where the battle scene shows fallen figures that have fallen perfectly in like perspectival space, and they're just lined up there perfectly. Now, we all know a battle doesn't work like that. It's a bit more helter-skelter. But I just wanted to highlight that for you because even amidst the chaos, there is this kind of artistic bravado being demonstrated here. But again, I didn't show you this last week, but I wanted to today on the theme of plants and kind of ecology and the power of place. Because this is a second, and the idea of serial art, so an artist doing the same thing multiple times in order to fully grasp a subject. And the work in our show is not the only one. I think I mentioned to you last week that Piero di Cosimo was very well known for this kind of approach and this theme and this subject. And he really wanted to, again, highlight that what he thought of as a kind of primitive past where things are just different. Like you can imagine the sound of this braying ox here in the, there's sounds happening here. There's a full-on sensory approach to what he's showing us. He wants sounds as well. And then this strangeness of the, I said the weird, wonderful world of Piero di Cosimo. I mean, he's starting to show us pigs with human faces. And, again, and if we think of the foliage, like just nature under attack here, an artist like Hieronymus Bosch is going to later make sequences like this famous, crows and blackbirds as like bad vapors, emitting from various, in his paintings, alchemical devices, things like that. But the point here is that the flames are engulfing, the animals are fleeing. I mean, there's not the same sense of violence as there is in our Met one, but this is full on about nature. The human presence is incredibly minimal, right? So, and what I love too about Piero di Cosimo, there are animals in here that are now extinct. You could do like an eco-critical study. I think I'll do that. An eco-critical study of Piero di Cosimo, thinking about literally what animals are shown, the ones that are no longer with us, the ones that never existed really, but he's showing them anyway, and the variety of birds here. So again, back to our human, non-human, but also on this trajectory with plants that we're engaging with. This is a really, really important one. And some art historians call him, one of the earliest landscape artists of the Renaissance. So, as I said, and that's indicated by the minimizing of human presence, as in a number of his works. Okay, and then sort of after that frenzy, we'll calm it down a bit and engage with this notion of the sacred and secular a little bit. And these, again, are two sort of more modest works in the show, but they're worth your attention as well. And again, I've brought these two together because they help us think of plants and the power of place and gardens. And, this garden is probably one of the most important in the Christian faith. And this lovely painting by Raphael, who, along with Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, is one of the trio of greats in Renaissance art, often applauded for a very lucid and clear and harmonious approach to painting. He died very young. He was 37, I think. And actually there was a quincentenary for his death that passed us right by because of the pandemic. They had these huge, he died in 1520, so last year was his quincentenary. And there was this huge, all these things planned for commemorating Raphael, and unfortunately everything got canceled because of the pandemic. But, they were ready to do it. His body famously is in the Pantheon. So a very beloved artist of the period. So what's our narrative here? Probably many of you know this narrative, but I will recount it just in case there are some who do not know it. So it's after the Last Supper, and knowing that his own betrayal is imminent, Christ goes into the Garden of Gethsemane with his apostles Peter, James, and John. And they all fall asleep while he prays. So he knows his doom is coming. And there, the quotes, the biblical text reads as follows: "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass me by. Nevertheless, let it be as you, not I, would have done it." And then a little while later he says, "If this cup cannot," notice the cup? "If this cup cannot pass by, but I must drink it, your will be done." So the cup is the symbol of his impending crucifixion. And he says that prayer 3 times. He's always checking if his mates are asleep. They still are. They just sleep right through all of this. And then he comments, "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." And apparently during this agony, so the agony is literally Christ. It is not his followers who are sort of blissfully ignorant to what's happening. And in one of the testaments, it says, "Sweat like drops of blood fell to the ground," and foreshadowing Christ's passion. Now, I think what's important to note, so obviously this thematic of the garden here as the site of something horrific, in fact, even though it is presented as this very peaceful place, so in which some can slumber and be peaceful while Christ is going through his agony. And I think what's important here to know, and again, this is only something you can know from reading the text and the exhibition catalogs, that the presentation up here was once very different. So this is a later addition to the painting. How do we know that? Okay, more like art history stuff, X-rays, there is this is a very clearly a later addition. And Raphael originally composed the scene to just show the chalice itself on the hill. So rather than being like brought in via angelic delivery, it was a thing in and of itself on the hill and just epitomizing that. Why is that? I think that's important. The tone of the scene changes there, and you can imagine how dramatic it would be just to have a chalice stuck on a hill like that. The supernatural quality of that would be very intense. But I just wanted to point that out to you, that that's a great example of how close looking matters, but so does the reading and the contextualizing and understanding that what you see isn't always what the artist originally intended. I keep saying these paintings have lives, and there are instances when, as we saw with the earlier works, the altarpiece is cut down, it's chopped up, it's fragmented. You're not seeing the thing in its entirety. And so knowing those moments, I think, are really important to our understanding. It's why art historians need their jobs, because this is an important part of understanding the work as it was intended to be seen. So now, and this, by the way, was also part of predella. So this Raphael painting was also part of the base of an altarpiece showing the life of Christ. So that's important too, because an artist will do things a little bit differently if it's sort of almost a subsidiary scene versus if it's the main event, right? So thinking of this as part of the base of an altarpiece is quite important. The Dossodossi, 3 Ages of Man, this is another example of a moment where it's helpful to read and understand that later editions can change the interpretation of paintings. Here, the older men, the pair there in the background, that's a later edition as well. It's completely impacted our reading of this work. The 3 Ages of Man, well, if they weren't there, what would we call it then? We'd call it something different. But I suppose that layering of meaning, the altarpiece, the work can acquire that meaning then too, if you see what I'm saying. So it's a whole question in art history. If you think of something as simple as fig leaves added to nudes during the 18th century, that changes, but the interpretation of the work, but it's also then part of the history of the work. So a whole question is around, do we want to see the artist's original intention, or do we want to see those later additions as part of the history of the work? Anyway, like Piero di Cosimo, this is an unusual scene. This is an unusual, the iconography here is unusual. Excuse me. With the foliage here now and this approach to landscape, we're now thinking of the idea of pastoral pleasures. Excuse me. Scenes of paradise, excuse me. Guys. Scenes of pastoral bliss. I'm losing my voice a little bit. Pastoral bliss. There it is. It's back. Okay. Pastoral bliss. So Acadia. So a scene where you can see shepherds and shepherdesses moving around in absolute paradise and bliss. And we have here this lush, kind of mysterious forest. And as the title is now indicating, the three scenes, three ages of humankind. Youth, maturity, old age. Youth, maturity, old age. And, a kind of landscape inspired in part by classical literature and intended to sort of delight the eye. And we also have here this entrance into the history of art of this idea of painted poems. So Titian, Giorgione, they're very interested in the relationship between images and text and how is a poem better or is a painting better? And so you have these entries into the debate, like here I am showing that a picture in fact can say as much as words or vice versa. This kind of debate and discussion going on. So we have with Dossodossi this interest in entering into that debate. He knew the works of Titian, he's thinking about them very carefully and articulating a sense around those. Okay, now, this El Greco, I think, is one of the brilliant and most courageous, fabulous works in the show. I use superlatives for it. And this is an artist who was absolutely an inspiration for moderns, but I think it's important to understand that in what he's doing, he's looking backward as much as anything because he's heavily inspired by Byzantine icons, those elongated forms, stretched out. Never let anyone tell you abstraction is invented in the 20th century because it's not. It's very important to an artist like El Greco. And I think when you look at El Greco, you almost feel like dancing. Look at the abstraction of his figures and this serpentine, flowing movement. Figures not really in defined space. They're restless and crowding in upon each other, yet graceful and elegant. And this abstraction is something he inherited from Byzantine art as much as his own personal kind of style. Here we see the gestures of Mary, Joseph, the shepherd, and angelic figures. They're indicating their excitement and wonder at the birth of Christ. And notice those dark, neutral grounds, the austere brown surrounding, but that's slashed with a kind of acidic pink and green. And the figures crowding in on the infant. I mean, the infant, it seems to radiate light in and of himself from the center of the picture. But not with, we've talked about gold halos and how important they are as an indication of holiness, and that is not happening here. It's pure white, okay? The cloth that reveals the form as important as his body. I mean, the figure is in fact, of Christ is in fact minuscule by comparison. The sacred lamb below, echoed below, and notice how white gets echoed throughout this picture. It's really extraordinary, those highlights. So place, thinking in terms of place, we are in a mystical and eerie place. That's the power of place here. Are we inside or are we outside? It's a liminal space with architectural form and that single green tree competing for attention. And the angel almost carrying that tree up here. It's just strange movement in the picture. And then what I love thinking about here too is this gesture sort of echoed in the background by this seemingly like tiny, tiny detail, like echoed. And it's almost as if there's a kind of looking there, happening, a kind of dialogue. And if we want to talk about a mystical space, No one does it better than El Greco. Look at this figure sort of looking up, very incidental to the narrative. This is the main event. It's thrust just in the foreground. But for an adventurous, curious eye, you start to wander and you go back here. We don't really have a consensus on who exactly this is, but look at just the drama. It's almost like a vortex, just heavenly, divine light, about to suck this figure up. So there's a lot of ways your eye can travel around this scene with those white highlights, with that dialogue going on here, this strange figure. There's a surreal quality to it, and you start to see this as proto-modern, and a lot of later artists, in fact, look to El Greco for a lot of inspiration for his approach to form. I just mentioned a vortex. This is kind of a vortex too. It's just this swirling mass, and if you just see, it's like the animals are just patched in there and just part of this writhing mass of like humanity. And he drew a lot of inspiration from Michelangelo. If you know the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel that he did late in his life, where he's embracing a kind of mannerist approach to form, like a more extended, and the damned and the saved. There's little distinction between the two of them. And here, that kind of approach to form is picked up by El Greco, and who really, this body makes no sense in a way, right? If you think of it, but he doesn't care. That this is about a mystical, dramatic, supernatural moment, and he gives it that with this sort of novel and incredible approach to paint. Another work that isn't in the Met show, but I have it here anyway, because it is really interesting to think of the works that came to us and the works that didn't. And, this is actually one of my favorite El Greco works, The Vision of St. John. And I think this, is a nice nod to a show that we have on. Sophie, is the Revelations show still up? Okay, so giving a plug to a show that is on right now at QAGOMA about the apocalypse, about the book of Revelation. And here El Greco is dealing with a moment from that narrative, so the end of days, basically. And it's depicting a passage in the book of Revelations describing the opening of the fifth seal at the end of time and the distribution of white robes, barely indicated here, actually, up above. The distribution of white robes to those who had been slain for the work of God and the witness they had borne. So you can see that, and famously Albrecht Dürer depicts the apocalypse narrative in a series of woodcuts that QAGOMA is proud to own and are now on display in a Revelations show curated by Sophie Rose. So go and have a look at that if you're interested in that narrative. And, there's so many weird scenes in the book of Revelations, lambs breaking open seals. That enough said. It's just a very sort of supernatural, and to watch artists deal with how to show that, how to show these strange narratives. There's a long history of that. It was a very popular theme in the medieval period. And then we have El Greco sort of placing himself in a history of art with that narrative himself. So showing his approach to the theme. And as I said, it involves all those characteristic, it's almost like a hallucination, I think. When I sort of mentioned a dream possibility for the power of place, these are the kinds of scenes that I had in mind. Locating our figures in a real space is very difficult here. As I said, they're almost swirling about. And if you look at the environmental elements at work, here, as in here, just the approach to atmosphere. So while this is not about plants in this moment, I will come back to plants in a moment, but this is about creating a space that is mystical, otherworldly. And in doing that, he is looking backward as much as anything. He is as interested in the art of the past as he is in the art of the present, and thinking of a tradition and history. Okay, and now some more different instances. Because to talk about the power of place and to think about, what the Met Show shows us, and as I said, that removal of the human presence towards the end of the show, and the emergence of landscape as a genre. I mean, there's no more concentrated and emphatic looking at place than in landscape art. Its emergence and its becoming a priority in places like the Dutch Republic. There's a burgeoning market for works like this that's very important. And the artist Claude Monet is really important to that story. The goals of this picture are completely different from what we just looked at with El Greco. So he's one of the first to concentrate almost exclusively on landscape. And he was sneaky. He does these massive vistas, sweeping, beautiful landscapes, and then, just tiny figures in the foreground, sometimes telling mythological stories. But really his emphatic interest is in showing those sweeping vistas. And important to understand that landscape, I mean, there's no genre that is more endemic to art, say in the 19th century, like so many landscapes, but the emergence of it as a genre did not take place overnight. And I think that's a really important thing to understand here. Speaking of artists inspired by poetry, I mean, and he's one of these artists who always gets referred to by his first name for some reason, Claude. He was inspired by the countryside around Rome, known as the Campagna. And again, this notion of Arcadia, so shepherds and shepherdesses in blissful paradise, is an important theme of his. These are composed landscapes, so they're not done en plein air, out in the open. He would have done sketches outside for sure, but then he would have worked it up in his studio. And this sort of darkened foreground, but look at the luminosity back here. It's absolutely incredible. And this is definitely one to go and have a look at because the way he captures light is absolutely amazing. And he becomes a touchstone for almost all artists who engage in landscape subsequently. So that beautiful sheer luminosity contrasted with that darkened foreground, but there's still light flickering through here, which is really beautiful to look at. We have a kind of relatively low horizon line and an emphasis on that upper atmosphere. These beautiful wispy clouds. I really sound like an art historian right now, but this is how we like to engage with works. Thinking about the decisions made around composition is absolutely really important. And then artists in the Dutch Republic pick up on this. They're very interested in evoking that power of place through their own landscapes, and Claude Monet becomes an inspiration for so many. Notice too, I mean, the people are just getting farther and farther away, aren't they? They're just disappearing into these roads and further away from us, more and more incidental to the scene. And there's not a hint of mythology or classicism about these. So that transition, again, it didn't happen overnight, but it's an important one to pick up on. And I think the Dutch Republic, as a kind of context and a place that allows for that to emerge as a genre, is really important to think about. So there's a new market for pictures there. There's a burgeoning middle class. There's a different kind of patronage than there had been in Italy. Economics changed things as well. So, there's a lot of contemporary reports from the Dutch Republic in the 17th century of, bakeries having pictures in them, just simple shops. So we're firmly moved away from, the sacred space being the preeminent one for patronage. This is about, more everyday individuals having ownership of works like this, which is a really important democratizing of art that's happening as well. What else do I want to say about this? And someone like Jacob van Ruysdael, I mean, for a long time in art history, there was this idea of assigning a kind of heavy iconographical significance to works like this, reading them in a more religious, overtly religious way. There's been a shift lately in the favor of a kind of more social history of art, something like I talked about last time. And I mean here, the idea of commerce, so, heavy rain clouds, the field of corn, the wind, there's an expression around the productivity, I suppose, of the Dutch countryside. Something else I would want to say about these two is that it's about home. So I said at the beginning, there's home, and then there's the exotic or travel or a place that's not your home. And so many of these Dutch artists are at home and very happy and showing just their home. There isn't this kind of longing to go elsewhere. Thinking of Rembrandt, who famously said, "Why would I leave? Like, I have everything I need here." He didn't have that desire to go to Italy that so many other artists did. So in this context, in this moment, yes, there are artists who feel they have to go to Italy to learn and study the sites there. But these two artists, Hobbema and Ruysdael, are really content to stay at home and explore their own regions. Speaking of beacons for artists, there's probably no better one to think about than Venice. And, in the same way that I just mentioned, Hobbema and Ruysdael as Dutch artists who stay home, Turner was drawn to Venice, as were so many artists of the period. And those of you who've been to Venice will know that it is a really unusual and unforgettable place that, it sounds corny, you return to in your dreams, but I've been thinking about Venice a lot lately because we run a Venice course and the future of it is challenged by the pandemic, etc. But we'll get back there. But anyway, thinking about Turner and just thinking of how, for some artists, travel was all they dreamed of. And, this romantic painter, Turner, very well known for his imaginative landscapes, sometimes violent marine pictures. And by the time of this work, he had considerable experience as a painter of seascapes. And the brilliance of his technique as a watercolor painter is just, it's unparalleled. It's extraordinary. And here, what I love is just the dissolving of form, literally, before our eyes. So the palazzi just, the reflection there, so perfect. And it's like the architecture is like dissolving before our eyes. That's the kind of movement I chart in this work. And, again, atmospheric effects. The power of place, the power of Venice, the power of Turner to show us that this is a city where land meets sea and, shimmering effects. And you think of how Venetian artists, what it's like to be in Venice and see all those shimmering reflections on the water reflecting backward. And, he really absolutely captures that here in such an evocative way. So I just wanted to put that there as, a place that many artists choose to return to time and again. Of course, the art historian will go, than me, it's not a perfect, depiction of the scene. There's things you're made up, okay? It's not a perfect, bird's eye view or photographic realism, no. Because we know, if you've been there, you know that some of these buildings are a little bit tall. It's like he's adjusted dimensions slightly to have, again, like Monet, that compositional effect. He wants to be able to present the buildings together. The salute is taller than this, that kind of thing. So, he would have, as I mentioned earlier with someone like Claude Monet, he would have done numerous sketches around. He would have, but he would have composed this in his studio back in England. He's not standing there depicting this with his canvas in front of him, etc. He's working it up, engaging with the composition in several steps prior to creating this totality. So that is, I think, an important element here as well. Okay, we are coming to the end. I'm sort of ahead of time. It's a rare event. We are flying through the centuries today. And I mean, when I was reflecting on this topic, and the kind of charting of the removal of human presence from paintings and works, and the way they become minuscule, and the whole human non-human element, I really feel with these two paintings, especially the Van Gogh, ironically, to me, as human presence is disappearing from these pictures, biography is coming in as something we can't ignore or forget about, because with artists like Van Gogh and Paul Gauguin, the biography around these artists is something, there's such a thorough awareness of it. We know Van Gogh, for example, was a very depressed individual. We all know the stories of his ear. We are privy to so many details around his life, and in a way, I find it difficult to look at a painting by Van Gogh and not have that in my mind. In fact, even with scenes like this, he is absolutely someone who paints scenes of nature devoid of human presence. So this is, unusual in the presentation. It's a rare moment to see, the scythe, the rake. Most of his scenes of orchards and gardens and this type of thing are devoid of human presence entirely. But for me, this is something worth thinking about and talking about. The biography enters with great intensity. In part, he's closer to us in time. We know a little more about him from letters and testimonials and a very thorough and researched life. Of course, someone who sells well as well. So the auction houses kind of establish those stories around him with great rigor. And so that is something I've been thinking about here. And then someone like Paul Gauguin, a very complex artist who, we know that he was, so home and elsewhere. That's kind of why I've paired these here. There's a reason I brought them together. They're friends, but they live such different lives. Van Gogh spends all his time at home, or in the vicinity. Gauguin, meanwhile, has this obsession with traveling to Tahiti, spends 12 years there, right, on several different trips. And if we're thinking of biography, this is one of the most complex, challenging, difficult, problematic biographies we can think of, particularly in our moment in time when, his relationship to the individuals he met in Tahiti, he married a couple of times, he called them savages, he fathered, there's a very complex history to this work. And in fact, there was an exhibition of Gauguin's at, where was it? The National Gallery in London that was seriously challenged. It was 2019, so just before the pandemic. And a lot of critics were calling for, saying, why should we even be looking at Gauguin anymore? Time to cancel Gauguin. We don't need to engage with his work. It's no longer enough to say his approach to form was so dramatic, he's important for us to look at and think about. So right here, I'm just trying to bring alive to you an existing problem, right? Because I've said biography comes to the fore intensely here, but when it does with someone like Paul Gauguin, it's very problematic and difficult. And there are questions around, should we continue to advocate and display works like this, or is the biography just so absolutely problematic that we cannot any longer? So there was an article in the New York Times, is it time to cancel Gauguin? This kind of thing. So in a way, I'm going to end on this note, which is a challenge note, and just to say that, when it comes to, and of course, there's the whole element of the exotic here, like Gauguin traveling to Tahiti, engaging there, showing colors he probably never even knew existed before his arrival there, right? The kind of palette shifts and changes so dramatically when he has that engagement. And of course, for us here in Australia, this opens up all kinds of questions, right? So it's another important work in our show. I'm proud of this pairing actually, because it does bring to light that whole notion of what can we depict? I mean, home or elsewhere? I mean, we're drawn to elsewhere, but do you see what I'm saying? Like this pairing opens up all kinds of questions. It's something Chris and I will talk about a little bit in our Q&A, because the further you go through the show, the more familiar you are with these biographies, the more those kinds of challenging issues, I think, can come up. And it's wrong to ignore them or just siphon it off and say, good art is art. We are in a moment where we do need to scrutinize these kinds of questions with care.